The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 4.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. Now, at the end of last evening's lecture, I promised that I would give you certain basic objectivist criticisms of Kant. I will keep that promise, only I'm going to postpone it until the conclusion of our discussion of Hegel. He is the star this evening, and I think it's only right that he get the primary billing. After we finish our discussion of Hegel, we will then backtrack and look at criticisms of Kant. Now I'm going to begin the discussion of Hegel by giving you one definite, unequivocal fact about him. He was born in 1770 and died in 1831. He was the ruling philosopher of the 19th century, far and away the most dominant, influential philosopher in Germany throughout the century, and as the century progressed, he became progressively very influential in Britain and the United States. And his influence in undiluted form continued until sometime early in the present century, at which point a reaction to him set in among philosophers. But many of the most famous philosophers of this century, conspicuously, for instance, John Dewey or Bertrand Russell, started in their youth as followers of Hegel, and then became, so they said, disenchanted. But much of 20th century philosophy can only be understood in relation to Hegelianism. In part, it's a rebellion against Hegel, and in part, it's a continuation of Hegel's principles. And as we'll see next week, of course, the communist, the Marxist approach to philosophy is, of course, profoundly determined by the Hegelian scheme. You couldn't have had Marx in the form you had him without Hegel. Now, Hegel represents the culmination of the Kantian approach to philosophy. Specifically, we can single out the fact that he represents the final assault on the concepts of existence and identity. As we saw in our study of Kant, Kant implicitly attacked the concepts of existence and identity, but there was still, so to speak, a vestige of respect for them in his work. For instance, in the case of Kant, he believed there was a reality independent of consciousness, only, of course, he said it was unknowable, but at least it was there, it existed. Some existence existed independent of consciousness. And as far as the law of identity, the laws of logic are concerned, Kant held that we did have to think consistently, that it was a gross violation of the proper method of thinking to violate the laws of logic. Even though we didn't know that the laws of logic were true of reality, he said, they nevertheless were built into the human mind and we had to obey them. Now, Hegel goes the whole way on both these counts. There is not even a vestigial respect for these 2 points left. There is, to tell you in advance at the outset, according to him, no reality at all independent of consciousness. There is only consciousness. And what we call existence or reality is merely a product or state of consciousness. In this sense, there is no real distinction, according to Hegel, between existence and consciousness, a point we'll develop shortly. As far as the law of identity is concerned, to warn you at the outset, Hegel explicitly denies it. Everything, we're going to lead you to his conclusion, everything he holds is both itself and not itself. A is A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. I'll do what I can to make these 2 points intelligible as we proceed. But I warn you in advance that the result of these 2 points of Hegel's philosophy is that his ideas are in places, and in not just a few places, all but unintelligible. So long as a philosopher grants some respect to reality and the principles of logic, you can follow him no matter what his errors. Usually you can follow him. But once he explicitly rejects reality and the principles of logic, the result is inevitably a great deal of gibberish. When a man endorses contradictions on principle, there's very little you can do to make it clear, because he is avowedly being self-contradictory. It's not surprising, therefore, that Hegel's obscurity is legendary. He is reputed to have said that only one man understands me, and even he doesn't. He is commonly regarded as the most difficult of all the major philosophers to understand, although I would say that in another sense he's one of the easiest to understand if you're not on the premise of trying to make consistent sense out of a philosophy which advocates a denial of the laws of logic. My goal this evening in discussing Hegel, therefore, differs in a certain way from what it has in preceding and what it will in succeeding evenings. I'm not going to make very much attempt to make Hegel's philosophy plausible or to present even superficially compelling arguments in favor of it. I don't know how to give a sympathetic, plausible presentation to this type of philosophy. I'm confining myself to this assignment. I'm going to state, perhaps describe is the better word, some of the central principles of Hegel, first trying to get as clear as we can as to what they could mean, and then point out in conclusion some of the applications of them which Hegel drew. So I merely tell you in advance, as a pedagogical mind clearer, if at certain points you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, please don't worry, because to be perfectly honest, neither do I, and neither did Hegel, and nor could anyone on these particular premises. All right, let us plunge in. Where shall we pick up Hegel? Well, the best place, I think, to start is with Hegel's attack on Kant's noumenal world. The noumenal world, as you know, reality as it really is in itself, according to Kant, was unknowable. Unknowable in principle, no one could know anything about it. Hegel attacks the concept of the unknowable. He holds, and perfectly validly, that the concept of an unknowable existence, an existence which by its very nature is incapable of being known, that such a concept is a contradiction in terms. If it's something were truly unknowable, it shouldn't ever come up. We shouldn't ever know anything about it, including that there was such a thing. To say, I know that X is unknowable, involves you in a self-contradiction. And you remember all of Kant's enormous difficulties and contradictions with the noumenal world. He talks about it, he calls it things as they are in themselves, applying the concept existence, while telling us that you can't apply the concept existence. He tells us at certain points that it causes our experience, but then that the concept cause is inapplicable. He talks about things in themselves in the plural, and then tells us quantity is inapplicable. He calls them things in themselves, and then tells us that entity, substance, thing is a category, and so on. Well, of course, if he were consistent on his own philosophy, the noumenal world should be just that unspeakable, unutterable X. And of course, even by calling it X, you imply something, and we can't even know that. It shouldn't come up. Hegel, therefore, says we must reject entirely the concept of the unknowable. Reality must be through and through knowable, through and through intelligible to man. And this, by the way, this insistence on Hegel's part was one of his attractions to 19th century philosophers. He claimed to provide a full system of philosophy explaining everything, making the entire universe knowable, intelligible, graspable. Well, now, where, according to Hegel, did Kant go wrong? What was Kant's error that led him to this unknowable realm? Well, Kant started with the idea that there was a reality independent of consciousness, that there really was an independent external reality, and that consciousness was supposed to discover its real nature. And then, of course, Kant claimed to have found out that consciousness couldn't, that all our consciousness could know was the phenomenal world, the world as processed by our mind, the world our consciousness itself creates. Kant, however, was still under the old-fashioned idea that there was an independent reality, because he thought the data that our mind processes has to have some source. There must be something out there which is appearing to us. And therefore concluded regretfully, although there is an independent reality, it's unknown. Well, what's the solution? If you grant Kant's basic premises and approach, but want to dispense with the unknown. Well, says Hegel, the solution is let's drop the idea that there is an independent reality. Let's completely reject the idea that there is anything as it actually is in itself at all. We just throw out the idea of things as they are in themselves, independent of consciousness. If consciousness can know only the world it itself creates, that of course was Kant's main conclusion, and Hegel agrees with it entirely. Consciousness can know only the world itself creates. On that premise, if there is an independent reality, it's unknowable. And if we must reject the unknowable, it follows we must reject an independent reality. There is no world then but the world that consciousness creates. Let us then, says Hegel, redefine what we mean by such terms as reality or existence or being. All of those we can use as roughly synonymous at present. We'll no longer think of reality or existence as an independent realm external to consciousness, which consciousness is trying to learn something about. We will rather think of what we call existence or reality as something in consciousness, a part of consciousness. We'll say existence is completely relative to consciousness. Just the way in which, if you want as a pattern, Kant's phenomenal world was. Now, the phenomenal world, remember, the world as it appeared to us, had no status or existence apart from its appearance in human consciousness. And precisely for this reason, it is completely knowable. If someone were to say to Kant about a phenomenal table, remember, the table just as it appears to us, how do you know you're perceiving the phenomenal table as it really is? The obvious answer would be, well, look, if it's a phenomenal table, then it isn't anything in itself. It is only the way it appears to me. It's only what I perceive it as, because it only exists in my perception of it. So I can't be wrong about what a phenomenal table is. If you want an example, which Hegel doesn't give, but to make this point, imagine for a second that you're having a hallucination of a pink rat. It's a hallucination. It's simply occurring in your mind. And you describe this, and someone says to you, well, how do you know that pink rat that you're experiencing is what you say it is? How do you know that you're not wrong in your description of it, that it appears to you one way, but in itself it's something else? You'd say, look, this is a hallucinatory rat. It's nothing but a state of my consciousness. It has no characteristics except what I experience. Consequently, I can't possibly be wrong in describing what this hallucinatory rat is like, because it's only what it appears to me as. Whereas, you see, if the rat were something in itself independent of you, the Kantians could always come along and say, well, how do you know you're perceiving it or grasping it as it really is in itself? In order, therefore, to ensure that reality is knowable, we are going to dispense with an independent reality. Kant had claimed, as I mentioned, that there was a twofold contribution to the process of knowledge. Reality gives you the data. The mind supplies the organization, the forms, the structure. Hegel says we don't need reality to get the data. Consciousness can supply out of itself both the data, the content, and the forms, the organization. It can produce the entire universe out of itself. It does not need any partner. We'll have then in Hegel's philosophy the Copernican revolution carried to the full. You see, there'll be no longer the vestigial element of an independent reality. We'll have a primacy of consciousness unparalleled up to this point. Existence is only the content of consciousness, a state of consciousness, a product of consciousness, however you want to put it. Now we can, and I'd like to familiarize you with this point, put the same point in several terminologies. It's the same point, but just different ways of putting it that will be helpful at different contexts. Hegelians frequently say there's no ultimate distinction between being known and being. To be known is the same as to be. To be is to be known. And you see, if they didn't maintain this, if they said there was a distinction, that would mean something could be without being known. It could be without being an object of consciousness. You then have existence independent of consciousness, and that's out. This is sometimes referred to as the principle of the identity of knowing and being. X exists means X is known by some consciousness. X is an object of consciousness. Again, it's very frequent to express this by saying that according to Hegel, there is no basic distinction between subject and object. Now, subject and object were traditional terms used by philosophers to stand respectively for human consciousness, which was the subject, the faculty of acquiring knowledge, and reality, which was the object, what consciousness was supposed to study. Well, of course, on this view, which collapses the distinction between consciousness and existence, it's just a reformulation to say it collapses the distinction between subject and object. Or we could put it another way and say there's no distinction between thoughts and things. No distinction between mind and matter. Keep in mind the Kantian noumenal table, the phenomenal table. That table is physical, but it's only a state of consciousness. It's only a state of human consciousness. For the Hegelians, what we call the object is a state of the subject. What we call a thing is a collection of thoughts. What we call matter is experiences in a mind. Now, I'm going to, this evening, let a very sympathetic commentator on Hegel speak at quite a number of points. I'll be reading to you passages from a book called The Philosophy of Hegel by W.T. Stace, S-T-A-C-E, recently deceased. If you want to do reading on Hegel, this is far and away the clearest presentation of Hegel that has ever been presented to my knowledge. In fact, I've heard it criticized by several people on the grounds that it is so clear that it couldn't possibly be a correct description of Hegel. But periodically he puts things as clearly as they can, and I'll let you get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Here's a quote on the point I just made. Quote, "To repudiate the superstition of the unknowable thing in itself is to establish the principle of the identity of knowing and being. Being means being for consciousness, and there is no being other than being for consciousness. An object is not an object unless it stands in relation to a subject. The universe is nothing but the content of consciousness. If we deny these truths, we land ourselves in the quagmire of contradictions connected with the theory of the unknowable." Unquote. Now that is a perfectly clear statement of this point. So the physical world, what we call the physical world, is a product of consciousness. In some way it must be derived from, dependent upon, some mind, Hegel frequently calls it spirit, thought process, something on that order. Now, you know that, or if you don't, you're finding out now, this type of metaphysics is called idealism. I don't think we've introduced that term up to now. Idealism is the name for a certain approach to the nature of reality. In its broadest sense, idealism is the view that true reality is ultimately non-material in nature, and that the material world is merely a product or expression of something more fundamental of a non-material nature. In its Hegelian form, of course, this non-material something, as we've seen, is mind or consciousness or spirit of some kind. And so Hegel is referred to as an idealist. Existence is a creation of consciousness. Now, if you come at this, you hear this for the first time, you may tend to misinterpret it, because you may think, well, does this mean that each human consciousness creates its own world, its own reality? You may very well ask, well, there's a great many individual human consciousnesses. If each consciousness creates its own reality, is Hegel saying each of us, in effect, is aware only of the content of his own consciousness and lives in and perceives only his own private world? that each of us only know what's going on in our own minds, in effect. Now, Hegel does not say this. Certain earlier idealists had tried this approach. Each individual mind, in effect, sustains or creates its own world, but they had reached a dismal failure by that method. Among many other problems, their view led to a theory known as solipsism. That's S-O-L-I-P-S-I-S-M. Solipsism is a derivative from certain Latin terms and is technically defined as the view that I myself alone exist. My mind is the totality of existence, and that everything else, all other people, mountains, stars, the entire physical universe, including, of course, all of you, are simply experiences in my mind. And you see how this would follow if you held that each mind creates its own reality. Because if that were so, how would any one mind ever know that that anything existed but his own mind and his own content? For instance, on that sort of view, all I know is the content of my consciousness. All of you are merely experiences in my mind. I have no access to anything outside my own consciousness. And therefore, I would conclude, as far as I know, there's only me and my experiences. Now, this solipsist view is obviously preposterous. No philosopher of any repute in the history of philosophy, and even those of ill repute, has really wanted to be a solipsist. For one thing, it's, of course, this is a crack, but true, it's very difficult to make converts to your view on this, but it's also obviously nonsense, and the Hegelians wish to avoid this conclusion. For this and for many other reasons, Hegel said, the mind upon which the world depends, the mind which truly makes up reality, is not your mind or mine, not any particular human or animal mind, but a cosmic mind. One single, all-embracing mind, which he gave a variety of names to, and the commonest is the absolute, the capital A always if you're writing about Hegel, the absolute or the absolute mind. This, he says, is true reality, and there's only one such absolute mind. So it's not true for Hegel that there's one world for your consciousness and a different one for mine, for his, for hers, etc. There's only one consciousness which produces reality, the absolute. Earlier idealists, prior to Hegel, were called subjective idealists. You see, on the grounds that each subject creates his own or sustains his own world. Well, Hegel, you can now see why, is called an absolute idealist, because there's this one all-embracing absolute cosmic consciousness which creates the world. Now, since there's only this one mind and everything depends on it, it follows for Hegel that there's nothing ultimately real but this absolute mind. What we call the physical world, and human beings and human minds, are merely projections or manifestations or expressions of the one absolute mind. As we'll see, the absolute mind goes through a long process of development. And in one of its stages, it manifests itself as a number of individual human beings perceiving a physical world. In that sense, says Hegel, it's true that we all do perceive a common physical world which doesn't depend on any one individual's awareness of it. But that doesn't contradict the basic principle of his idealism, he says, because the whole business, our minds and the physical world, etc., all of that is merely a manifestation of production or reflection of the absolute mind and is kept in existence by it. Now, the absolute, I should tell you, has a goal. It's struggling to know itself, to fulfill itself, to discover its true nature, which is, as we'll see, a very difficult thing for it to do. Its goal is to become fully self-aware. I will not bother you with the reasons why Hegel ascribes this goal to it, but you could just, in a very crude way, imagine to yourself, if you were the totality of reality and were a consciousness, what could you do but be aware of yourself? In any event, it's out to achieve complete, perfect self-consciousness, and it has to go through a very complex process to do so. Now, let us try to see if we can make some sense or intelligibility out of this idea of an absolute mind in its production of the physical world. Now I have to tell you that since it goes through a constant process of development or evolution on the way to its ultimate goal, what you're going to say about it at any one stage of its development will be radically different from what you'll say at another stage. Well, let's start at the earliest stage. The earliest stage in the development of the absolute. Now you mustn't think at this point of the absolute as a mind in the sense, for instance, of the Judeo-Christian God. The Judeo-Christian God is popularly conceived, has a personality, a will, a desire, a plan. He loves his children. He produces the world by an edict. He says, let there be a world, and there's a world, and so on. Hegel does not construe the absolute on this model. He does regard the absolute mind as, in some sense, a divine principle, and he frequently refers to it as God. But at this stage, let's think of it as an impersonal mind. It would be even better to call it an abstract thought process, or even better to think of it as a system or collection of thoughts or concepts or ideas which somehow underlie and give rise to the physical world. Now you ask me, what does this mean? Well, I think the best way for you to understand is if you remember the intimations of Plato I gave you in the opening lecture, because Hegel is here heavily influenced by Plato. Remember, for Plato there were two worlds, the world of universals and the world of particulars. One was true reality. It wasn't in time, the world of forms, remember. It wasn't in space. Sheer universals. You had subway hood up there, but no particular subways, pure beauty, but no concrete beautiful things. They were down here, etc. And according to Plato, this world in which we live was simply the manifestation in a physical form of that world of universals or forms. Well, from Plato's point of view, if you want to understand this world in which we live, you had to do two things, essentially. First, you had to understand what are the various universals which make up true reality, and then you have to see how this physical world in which we live is dependent on and derives from the world of universals. Now, in a general way, with many crucial differences, Hegel takes over this scheme from Plato. He believes that there's a realm of real universals, pure universals. They're spaceless, timeless, non-physical, outside the province of sense perception. They somehow underlie or make possible the physical world in which we live. And one of the main goals of his philosophy is to understand the content and structure of this realm of universals. And then he's going to show how the physical world can logically be understood as a consequence of this world of universals. He's going to deduce the physical world from the realm of universals. So when we say that the absolute is to be construed as a collection of thoughts or concepts, you can understand by that approximately a collection of universals on the order of Plato's. If you understood Plato's view, you won't have any difficulty essentially with Hegel's here. Now I may mention that under the influence of Kant, Hegel called his system of thoughts or universals which underlie and give rise to the physical world, he called them the categories. Only now, of course, not categories of the subjective human mind, but categories of the absolute. Now there are certain differences, however, between Plato and Hegel. Plato's world of universals, in spite of his best attempts, ended up as, in effect, a haphazard collection. To every group of things down here, there was a universal up there. And Plato, for all his attempts, was not able to explain why the particular universals that populated the world of forms existed and not any others. He wasn't able to outline their necessary connections and necessary relationships. Plato had claimed that if you study for years, at a certain point you reach a mystic vision which will reveal to you why only these universals and no other, and why they're all connected as they are. But Hegel rejects that mystic vision as a solution. And therefore he holds that we have to bring order and system into the realm of universals. We must logically understand exactly what universals or thoughts are real and why those and no others. We must understand the exact logical relations between them. So that starting from the most basic universal, we will then be able rigorously to deduce all the rest by a process of sheer logic. Then we will really understand the content and structure of the realm of universals. And then, of course, our next assignment is, once we understand the structure and content of the world of universals, explain how the physical world derives from or is related to the world of universals, a thing which Plato struggled to do but with conspicuous failure. Now, the study of the basic universals, we're going to now ascend to the world of universals prior to the break. We'll leave the physical world for now. The study of the basic universals or concepts or categories which underlie and give rise to the physical world, Hegel calls logic. And what he proposes to show is that if we start from one of these universals or categories, we can, by a process of inexorable logical reasoning, deduce all the rest, so that the realm of universals would be a completely intelligible system. And then we will be able, as a second step, to deduce the physical world in all its details from the realm of universals, showing that it's simply a logically inevitable consequence. The crucial point of it all is going to be that each step of our deduction is logically inevitable. And at the end, therefore, we're going to have a complete explanation of the entire universe, of every aspect of it. Now you see why Hegel is called a rationalist philosophically, because he holds that we can discover and explain the nature of the entire universe by logic alone, simply by logical inference. Obviously, you can't observe these universals, they're not accessible to sense experience, but he says they occur in our thinking also, and by the sheer use of logic, we can discover their relations and how the physical world comes from it. Well, now we have a problem. We have many, but let's pass over them and just pick up one to go on. I said we're going to start with the basic category or universal and deduce all the rest from it. But how are we going to be able to do that? Whatever category or universal we start with, suppose we pick on something, let's call it X, just to abstract it. Any other category will not be X. It'll be a different one. So it'll be non-X, symbolically, just by definition. How are we going to be able to deduce non-X from X? Now, you know, of course, that in valid deduction, you cannot get something in your conclusion that you did not have implicitly in your premise. Deduction is a process of going from the implicit to the explicit. I can't say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. You'd say to me, where did Napoleon come from in the conclusion if there's no reference to it in the premises? The conclusion must somehow be implicit in the premises. So if we're going to get a category non-X by deduction from a category X, non-X would somehow have to be in X in the first place. X would have to contain non-X to begin with if we were going to be able to deduce it out of X. But what does it mean to say non-X is inherent in X? Well, we're on the threshold now of Hegel's big discovery. It means that X, and of course this will stand for any concept or universal, X contains within it its own opposite. X contains within it its own contradictory. If we generalize, we'll say that every concept contains its own contradictory within it, contains its own opposite hidden away within it, which means that every concept is inherently contradictory. And Hegel's conclusion is going to be that all concepts, and therefore the entire world, is basically contradictory. It's X and non-X, or if you prefer the traditional symbolism, it's A and non-A. Now I must give you an example, which is going to be more than just an example because it'll give you the mechanism of the Hegelian system. Let's start with the first and most basic category, which according to Hegel is the category being. Being. If you ask why is that the first and most basic, the answer would essentially be that that precedes any other category. whatever else you say about a thing, first of all, it has to exist. It has to have being. Whether you say it's a cause or an uncle or a substance or it's red, before it can be any particular thing, it must be. So being is in effect the basic category. Now our assignment is going to be to show you we got to get the contradictory of being by valid deduction out of it. In other words, starting with the idea of being, we're going to have to show that that contains the idea of non-being or nothing. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to give, that'll be the first crucial Hegelian deduction. If you get this one, you get the pattern for the rest, and I will not take you through any more. I'm going to let Professor Stace give you this one. You follow him. Quote, we begin with the category of being. It is the pure category that we have to think, not any particular sort of being, such as this pen, that book, this table, that chair. It is the entirely abstract idea of being in general, pure being. It's the universal, you see. We have to abstract from all specific determinations or qualities, whatever. We can form this abstract idea, if we wish, from a concrete object. Say, for instance, this table. He points to a particular one. But you have to abstract from all of its qualities, whatever. Its squareness, its brownness, hardness, even its very tablehood. We have to think its mere isness, its being, what it has in common with every other object in the universe. Well, such being has in it no determinations, no qualities whatever, because we have abstracted away from all qualities. Are you ready now? Because we're on the threshold of the deduction. Such being is therefore absolutely indeterminate and featureless, completely empty and vacant, a pure vacuum. It has no content. For content of any kind would be a specific determination. This vacuum, this utter emptiness, is not anything. It is the absence of everything, of all determinations, quality, character. But such absence of everything is simply nothing. Emptiness or vacancy is the same as nothing. Being, therefore, is the same as nothing. Well, I'm glad you smile, because then you follow. And the pure, I continue the quote for a few sentences longer, and the pure concept of being is thus seen to contain the idea of nothing. But to show that one category contains another is to deduce that other from it. Hence we have deduced the category nothing from the category being. We may put the same thing in another way. To say that a thing is, but that beyond its mere isness it has no qualities or characteristics of any kind, this is equivalent to saying that the thing is nothing at all. Pure is, therefore, mere is without any further determination is the same as is not. Being is identical with not being, or nothing. Unquote. Being is the same as nothing. The first deduction. Now you'd think if a person reached this conclusion, he'd say, I must have made a dreadful mistake. You think he'd say, my original concept of being must have been wrong. And of course, if you stop for 2 seconds, you'd say, however abstract a concept of being you form, you cannot separate being from being something. You may not know what the particular something is, but still to be something. Existence is identity. Now, if you started with that concept of being, you couldn't get nothing out of it. But of course, Hegel doesn't do that. He starts with sheer being, which isn't anything in particular, and then his discovery is, since it isn't anything in particular, it's nothing, and therefore being is the same as nothing. Well, let's grant that for a moment, because there's more to come. Where are we now? Well, we have a contradiction. Being is the same as non-being. Hegel is a rationalist. And he says that reason cannot be satisfied with a contradiction. He doesn't say he must have made a mistake. Instead, he says this: This contradiction, which is real, must somehow be reconciled, resolved, abolished. How? Well, says Hegel, there must be a third concept, a third category which unites the two previous ones and somehow reconciles the contradiction. Something that'll pull together being and non-being and fuse them in such a way that the contradiction will no longer be so starkly naked. What is the third category in this case? Hegel calls it becoming, which you can take approximately as a synonym for changing. Now here I remind you of Heraclitus, who was very influential on Hegel. Remember Heraclitus' point, when a thing changes, it is what it was, but it's changed, so it isn't what it was. Remember the match that I lit for you, and at the end, it is the same, but it isn't. Well, change for Heraclitus then involves a contradiction. You have a thing which is and is not. A becoming thing, a changing thing, is therefore a thing which partakes of being and non-being, and therefore somehow unites or synthesizes the two contradictories in one third concept. A becoming thing, a changing thing, is a thing which is and isn't, in the process of becoming what it will and won't be, you see, so that both being and non-being are fused in the concept becoming. Now look what we have. We have a trinity. We have three. Being led us inexorably to nothing and then to becoming. And notice that these form a triad. This is your first Hegelian triad. And it's important for us to understand this as far as we possibly can, because this whole system proceeds by these triads. They are known as dialectic triads. That's dialectic. It is not dielectric, dialectic triads. And the process of going from the first to the second to the third and so on is called the dialectic process. One category, A, gives rise to its exact opposite, its exact contradictory, non-A, and then we must have a third which somehow reconciles the first two. Again, I'll let Professor Stace speak to this point. Being, quote, being, nothing, becoming is the first Hegelian triad. Throughout the entire system there is this triple rhythm. The first category in each triad is always, as here, an affirmative category. It lays itself down as a positive assertion. For example, being, is, etc. The second category is always the negative or opposite of the first. It denies what the first affirmed. For example, not being is not, etc. The second category is not brought in by Hegel from any external source. It is deduced from the first category, and that means that the first contains the second and is shown to produce it out of itself. Thus, the first category contains its own opposite and is identical with it. At this point, the two categories stand confronting and contradicting each other. But it is impossible to rest in this contradiction, for it means that opposite categories are applicable to the same thing at the same time. It means, in the case of this triad, that if we affirm that anything is, we must at the same time admit that it is not, because being necessarily involves not being. Therefore, if a thing has being, it also must have not being. How can the thing both be and not be? The answer is that it both is and is not when it becomes. The category of becoming, therefore, resolves the contradiction. In other words, the contradiction between the first and second categories is always reconciled in a third category, which is the unity of the two preceding, unquote. Now, of course, these three members of the triad, as you probably know, are always called, the first is the thesis, that would be being, in this case. The second, the exact contradictory of it, is the antithesis, and the third, in which the two of them are merged, is the synthesis. Now, for Hegel, this dialectic process is the law of the entire universe. For Hegel, and I may say later, for Marx and the communists. So I'd like to try to get as clear as we could, if you'll bear with me on this first triad for a bit, just to try and get clear, because everything hereafter is going to go by triads. I said that the synthesis unites or resolves or somehow reconciles the contradiction between the first two, between being and non-being. In this case, between the thesis and the antithesis. It gets rid of the contradiction somehow. Now you may, in all innocence, ask me, how does it do that? Do you mean that by the time we get to the synthesis, being is now just identical with non-being? There's no contradiction anymore between the two? Because you could perfectly well ask me, they're still exact opposites, aren't they? How does becoming resolve or get rid of the contradiction between is and is not, between being and non-being? Well, the answer is that, according to Hegel, actually it doesn't. The contradiction is still there. Being is still the contradictory of non-being. Now you say, but you just said that the thesis is supposed to abolish the contradiction. That's the synthesis, rather. You just said the reason we need a synthesis is that we have to abolish the contradiction. That's the whole reason to get it. And now I've just told you, well, the contradiction is still there in the synthesis, even though it isn't. And you may have trouble grasping this notion. Hegel's answer is, the law of identity is what is causing you trouble. If you could only dispense with that perspective, if you could see that the law that A is A is a low, inadequate law, you would have no difficulty. Because the truth is that the synthesis of one of these triads both abolishes and preserves the contradiction. Both abolishes and preserves the contradiction. When you reach the synthesis, the contradiction between the preceding two is still there, but it isn't. But it is. Now, one of the reasons I read is because you may very well otherwise wonder, can this be accurate as a presentation of Hegel? I quote from Professor Stace. Quote, the synthesis of a triad both abolishes and preserves the differences of the thesis and antithesis. This twofold activity of the synthesis is expressed by Hegel by the word Aufheben. If you want to learn any one German word, you can almost not discuss Hegel without that word, so you may want to write it down. A-U-F-H-E-B-E-N. Aufheben. In the past participle, it's aufgehoben. Now, this German word, that's the name for what the synthesis does. And I'm quoting now from Professor Stace still. This German word has two meanings. It means both to abolish and to preserve, which is very convenient. That was not in the text. Continuing the quote, the English phrase to put aside has a similar double meaning. To put a thing aside may mean to put it out of the way, to have done with it, to abolish it. For instance, I say to you, put aside your childish ways. You say, get rid of it. Or it may mean to put aside for future use, to keep and preserve something. As for instance, this is my example, not Professor Stace's, Senator Edward Kennedy has put aside his presidential aspirations, let us say temporarily, but not in the sense of abolishing, but of nourishing and preserving them for some future use. Well, if you understand this dual usage of put aside, Aufheben has the same dual usage, and we can say that, continuing the quote, the differences between the first and the second members of each triad are aufgehoben by the third. First, the difference is abolished. Being and nothing and the opposition between them are merged in the unity of becoming. But at the same time, the difference is preserved within the new category. It is not simply wiped out. The new category is an identity of differences. An identity of differences. Sometimes called an identity of opposites. The fact that it is an identity of differences means that the differences are merged. You see, they're identical, they're the same. The fact that it is an identity of differences means that they are preserved. We have not a mere identity. In other words, a simple abolition of differences. Nor have we mere opposition. In other words, a simple preservation of differences. What we have is an identity of opposites, unquote. Now, if you say, well, you just don't get what would an identity of opposites be? If you say to me, if two things are identical, they're not opposite. And if two things are opposite, they're not identical. If the contradiction is preserved, it's not abolished. And if it's abolished, it's not preserved. That seems to be the most elementary kind of obvious question you could ask. How can two things be the same and opposite? And here, the Hegelian answer is it's the influence of Aristotle that is throwing you off the track. The faculty that follows Aristotelian logic, she uses the law of identity and the law of contradiction, Hegel calls the understanding. And that is a comparatively low, inadequate, one-sided faculty. The faculty which employs the dialectic process and which grasps how in the synthesis the preceding two are there and are not, and everything is aufgehoben, that dialectic faculty he calls reason. And in his terms he would say, if you don't follow me, it's because you're letting your understanding interfere with your reason. That's the cause of the confusion. One more quote from Professor Stace on this point. For understanding, A and B are either identical or different. For reason, they are both identical and different. The principle of reason is identity in difference. Understanding has a twofold principle. The identical is the identical, A is A, this is the law of identity. And the different is the different, A is not non-A, this is the law of contradiction. The principle of reason is rather that what is different is also identical, that A is not A. Understanding will insist that either two categories are the same, in which case there's no difference between them, or they're different, in which case they're not identical. Reason asserts that they are at the same time both identical and distinct. Being is different from nothing, for it is its opposite. But being is also identical with nothing, for both are the same vacancy. Unquote. What is the conclusion we come to? Reality is inherently contradictory, operates dialectically in this thesis, antithesis, synthesis pattern. Every occurrence, concept, fact, thing, you name it, contains its own contradictory, which proceeds out of it by dialectic necessity, and the two are then aufgehoben in a third, which contains the two previous contradictories while abolishing their contradiction, while preserving it, while abolishing it. Now, we just have to complicate it one step further for you to get the idea of the overall pattern. We don't just have one triad. When we reach the first synthesis, becoming, it becomes the thesis for a new triad, a higher triad. It generates a new antithesis. And then we'll have a new synthesis in which the preceding ones are aufgehoben, and it generates a new antithesis, etc. So you can think of it as though, in effect, reality waltzes to destiny. It's the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis together, which become the thesis for a new antithesis and a new synthesis, and so on. Each synthesis is richer, fuller than the preceding. We never lose the earlier stages because they're merged in the synthesis, which just carries them along onto the next synthesis, and so on. So each one is richer and fuller as we go, until ultimately we're going to end up with a final synthesis. And if we're on the level of the universals or categories, that'll mean a final category which will preserve all the preceding contradictions, and there's something like 100 of these categories, while simultaneously uniting them all into one, and it will no longer generate a new category. Short of reaching this high of synthesis, we can't stop anywhere. You see why it's so difficult to describe the absolute to you. Because if I say about any category, this is what it is, I can't say that because, of course, it's immediately passing into its antithesis, and if I try to pin it down, it's already passed on to its synthesis, which is the thesis for a new antithesis, and so on. as it goes. Reality is this dialectic process. It's sheer process. If you remember here Heraclitus, you see in what enormously influential ways he has acted upon Hegel, who had great admiration for Heraclitus. Heraclitus' view that reality is inherently contradictory. Heraclitus' view that reality is essentially process, motion, change, that nothing ever stands still. Both of those essential points of Heraclitus that we presented are taken over in full by Hegel, and the dialectic process is really Hegel's adaptation of Heraclitus. It's like Heraclitus mediated by Kant, so to speak. Well, now you know that, at least to this point, that reality is a mind of some sort, which has a goal, which is developing, which is fulfilling itself by the dialectic process. And therefore, if we want another name for Hegel, call him a dialectic idealist. That'll be in contrast, of course, to Marx, who is going to be called next week a dialectic materialist. Now, so far I've only talked about the categories, the abstract universals. I haven't brought the physical world into the picture. Well, let's take a break, and you see if you can, during the break, figure out how we're going to get a physical world, including people, into existence out of this abstract realm. Okay, we'll take a break. Now, up to this point in the career of the Absolute, we do not yet have any reference to a physical world. All we have is the dialectic progression of 100 or so timeless, spaceless, non-physical universals or categories, all of them ultimately synthesized or aufgehoben into one final category, which, if you're curious, Hegel calls the logical idea. Its nature is irrelevant to our purposes. The question is, how do we get physical nature from this procession of categories? That was part of our original program, to deduce the world and everything that's in it from this progression of universals. Now, on the face of it, you'll think this is a terrific problem, because you'll say the system of logical categories, and let's use Hegel's word and just call them logical categories. System of logical categories on the one hand and physical nature on the other are so radically different. On the one hand, we have a series of thoughts. On the other, a world of things. One is of a mental nature, the other is physical. One is a world of universals, the other a world of concretes, of particulars. One is a procession of ideas, the other, we talk here about inanimate nature, is mindless, just physical. One is not in space and time, the other is in space and time. You'll say they're exact opposites of each other. They're exact antitheses of each other. And then, if you follow it up to now, you should say, nature, physical nature, is the exact antithesis of the categories. Now, if you remember the dialectic process, you know that everything generates its own contradiction. Everything generates its own antithesis and must by the dialectic law. This is a matter of unavoidable necessity. The thesis must give rise to the antithesis. Therefore, very far from it being a problem, the opposition between the physical world and this logical progression of universals requires that the categories produce and necessitate nature. The thesis must give rise to the antithesis. If you really understand the dialectic process, then you will see how nature is inevitably necessitated. In fact, you'll see that the physical world really is the categories. Because remember, the thesis and the antithesis are identical. Of course, they're opposites, but it's an identity of opposites. And therefore, nature really is the categories. Although, of course, it isn't, but it really is nevertheless. If then we say that the absolute is the categories, and the categories are nature, then we have to conclude nature is not something independent of the absolute. Nature is the absolute. Everything is the absolute. Only nature is the absolute
so to speak, under the guise of the antithesis. As Hegel says, the physical world is the absolute, quote, in its externality, in its otherness, close quote, one of his clearer utterances. In other words, one of the stages that the absolute goes through in order to reach self-consciousness is to project itself outward as a physical world. Nature is the absolute revealed in the forms of space, time, matter, and Hegel somewhere calls it petrified intelligence. Intelligence, you see, indicating its connection to the absolute, and petrified, suggesting that it's material. So much for a deduction of the physical world from the stream of categories. Now, I may mention that since nature is the absolute, it's governed by the same dialectic process that the system of categories is. And if, therefore, you want complete knowledge of nature, including, and here are some of the things I quote from Hegel, gravitation, the solar system, sound, heat, the moon and comets, the sea, etc., close quote. To grasp all this knowledge of the physical facts of nature, you need merely discover the dialectic process as it operates in nature. You just have to find the appropriate triads. Just as in the discussion of the categories, we found the right starting point and deduced all the others. I only gave you the first three, but take my word, he goes on relentlessly through them all. Similarly, if we start at the right point with nature, we can deduce all physical phenomena by sheer dialectic logic from the appropriate starting point. And Hegel attempted to do this. This is an aspect of his system which has least endured across time and influence, and his followers usually tend to downplay this particular aspect of it. As I recall, he had just come out at some point with a dialectic proof that there could only be, I think it was 7 planets, which was all that was known at the time, and he had claimed to show that that was dialectically necessary, granted the operation of these triads, and I think it was a week or a month after his discovery they found an 8th planet, so we had to go back and rig it around again. In any event, we've got a system of categories which, in its antithesis, is the physical world. Have we come to the end? No. Because we have a thesis and antithesis now of a grand triad, categories and nature. We must have a final synthesis in which the two preceding will be unified, synthesized, reconciled, aufgehoben. We have to end up with some one phenomenon, whatever it is, in which everything in the preceding stages is resolved. And this final synthesis will be the culmination of reality. It'll be such that the thesis and the antithesis, the categories and nature so far discussed are merely the earlier stages. We want something that's going to synthesize or unify the categories and nature. What is it? The final synthesis. Hegel's answer is mind. It's also translated spirit. Mind or spirit. And he means by this human minds or human spirits. Human consciousness, in effect. Now you may ask, how is the human mind a synthesis of a procession of universals and the inanimate physical world? I will be brief on this point, but you can look at it approximately like this. The categories on that level, the first stage, are simply an impersonal thought process, and he frequently calls the procession of categories a process of reason, but it's an abstract, disembodied reason, a succession of sheer universals. Nature, on the other hand, is concrete, specific, physical, but by itself apart from man, without reason. It's mindless, just physical. Well, the synthesis of the two would be a reasoning process which is now concretely embodied in nature, in some natural physical organism. And in the development of the human mind, says Hegel, we have just this. We have a natural organism, a thing with a physical body, and therefore it partakes of nature, of the antithesis, and yet it's endowed with reason. It has commerce with universals, abstract concepts, ideas, and therefore it partakes of the thesis. And so the development of man, specifically the human mind, is dialectically necessary. In the fact that human minds exist, the previous thesis and antithesis are aufgehoben. Human minds, in effect, are the culmination of reality, the final synthesis. Now, assuming that you follow this at all, you may say, well, don't we have another problem now? And you may remind me as follows. You may say, you started off by telling us that according to Hegel, there's only one cosmic mind, that it develops according to the dialectic process, and its goal is to discover its own nature, to become fully self-aware. And now you may say, you've just told me that the final stage is the human mind. Now you may object to, you don't get this. The human mind is the highest expression, the ultimate synthesis. After all, you may say there's many human minds, and yet you told us there was only one ultimate mind. How do we get one mind out of many? You may say if there's only one cosmic mind, then there can't really be many individual minds. And if there's many, there can't really be one. And it obviously seems that my mind is different from your mind, his mind, her mind, etc. But if you ask that question, you have forgotten the dialectic process. You have forgotten the identity of opposites, which in this context means, true enough, human minds are each individual and different, but they are also the same. There are many, and yet they are also one. There really is only one mind, the absolute, and therefore individual human minds, though they differ, must really be ultimately the same. We have to learn to see them as just so many manifestations of the one absolute. We can put the point another way. The appearance of separate individual minds, my mind, your mind, his mind, etc., is true, says Hegel, as far as it goes. But it's a comparatively low stage of the dialectic process. Just as the categories evolve or develop dialectically, each step containing and synthesizing the previous and going on enriched, just as nature develops dialectically, so the human mind must develop dialectically. And each higher stage must contain and synthesize the preceding stages. And if we follow this process out, we'll see how at a certain point all of the individual human minds, so it seems to us individual, are all synthesized, aufgehoben, into one, which is the absolute. Now, if you don't see this yet, that simply means you are at an earlier stage of the dialectic process. Actually, I should say, since you are the absolute, if you don't see it, the absolute doesn't see it. At this stage of the game, the absolute, in effect, doesn't realize that all these separate minds are really itself, really one. But it will discover this as the process continues. At a certain point, the absolute is going to come to see that all human minds are one, namely it itself, and that therefore all separations and distinctions between me and you, and him and her, are merely lower stages of development when the absolute hasn't yet grasped its true nature. Now, Hegel outlines the process whereby the absolute gets to grasp that all minds are really one and that's it. He outlines this process in great detail, but I want now to indicate to you only its political implications. What do you think will be his political view given this overall framework? What will be, in a political context, the unit of reality and of value? The individual or the state? The particular person or the collective, the group? Well, I think the answer should be obvious. On this metaphysical foundation, individuality is not ultimately real. Distinctions are unreal. Everything is ultimately one. In such a case, the union of all the apparent alleged individuals into a group, their union where each of them loses personal identity and identifies with, blends into, merges with all the others, as far as that's possible, that union will be closer to true reality. Distinctions will be obliterated, will be closer to the all-encompassing distinctionless one, which is the absolute. The group, in a word, is a higher manifestation of reality than the individual. In fact, since everything is one in this way, Hegel claimed that the state is the true individual. The state, in other words, is not simply a collection of separate, independent individuals. Its members are related to the state on the analogy of the way the cells or the organs of a body are related to the organism, to the body of which they're a part. Now you take a stomach, for instance. The reality, the function, the value of a stomach is entirely in the contribution it makes to the life of the body. And if your stomach should one day be able to hold a conversation with you and try to assert itself and say, I have certain rights and today I don't feel like digesting the food or whichever, you would come back and say, you are nothing as a stomach but a fragment of a totality. Entire function and justification and existence of service to this totality. If I sever you, you couldn't function or be at all. And therefore you're entirely merged in the totality. Well, in the same exact model, the citizens of a country, according to Hegel, have no autonomy, no independence. They must merge into one entity, one superorganism, which is the state. And therefore, you see, the appearance of separate, individual, autonomous human beings is really just an appearance. When we reach the level of the state, all these individuals are synthesized, merged, aufgehoben into one unity. You see the arch collectivism in this theory. It's often referred to as the organic theory of the state. The idea being the state is like an organism. And of course it was not originated by Hegel. It goes all the way back. Plato, for instance, was a staunch advocate of the organic theory of the state. A quote again from Professor Stace on this point. Quote, the state is an absolutely necessary development of the world reason, an embodiment of the absolute. It is not a means for securing the welfare of the individual. It is not a means to anything. It is an end in itself. And because it is a higher end than the individual, it may demand the sacrifice of the latter to its higher ends. Thus, all theories which regard the state as a mere combination of individuals for mutual protection, or as existing in order to increase the wealth and strength of its members, or as a compromise or contract whereby individuals agree to restrict their liberties on condition that all other individuals do the same, all such theories are to be condemned because they make the state a mere means to carry out the ends of the individual. The state, on the contrary, is the higher end. Unquote. Now, the degree of state worship in Hegel is such that by comparison, Plato seems virtually to be an individualist. That's a somewhat metaphorical and exaggerated statement, but nevertheless, there is a virulent, intense state worship in Hegel, which was taken over by the Nazis, fascists, and the communists. The true modern source of such state worship is Hegel. Here are a few representative quotations from Hegel on this subject. Apart from the state, he's developing this thesis, the individual has neither reality nor value. Quote, it is only as one of the state's members that the individual himself has objectivity, genuine individuality, and an ethical life. Unquote. Quote, all the worth which the human being possesses, all spiritual reality he possesses only through the state. Unquote. And now remember, this state organism is not simply a this-worldly secular entity. It's a manifestation of the absolute, an unavoidable manifestation. And the absolute, remember, is a divine principle. Hegel also calls it God. And the state, therefore, requires and demands reverential worship from its citizens. The state, says Hegel, is, quote, an absolutely divine principle whose, quote, majesty and absolute authority must be recognized. quote, the state is the divine will in the sense that it is mind present on earth, unfolding itself to be the actual shape and organization of a world, unquote. The state is, quote, a secular deity, unquote, whom man must, quote, venerate. Quote, the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. Quote, and this next one I think is the clearest. The march of God in the world, that is what the state is, unquote. The march of God in the world, that is what the state is. Well, of course, that type of almighty divine entity has complete supremacy over the individual. Says Hegel, the state has, quote, supreme right against the individual whose supreme duty is to be a member of the state. That is all, I think, very clear. Now you may say, well, Hegel is then an opponent of individual freedom. He's an advocate of slavery. To which Hegel says, absolutely not. He says in his type of state, you will be really free, and that he is a champion of freedom. Now if you come back and say, but your state can force an individual to sacrifice himself. It can force him to do something against his will. It can inflict compulsion upon him. It can require him to serve the state against his desires. How is that freedom? Isn't freedom doing what you will to do? To which Hegel says, true enough, yes, freedom is doing what you will to do. But the big question is, what are you? Which you do you have in mind? If you think of yourself as one individual, metaphysically distinct from others, then maybe when that you wills will come in conflict with what the state decrees. That's your apparent will, your superficial will, the will as it appears to you on a lower stage of the dialectic process, where you're still infected with the idea that you're one individual and somebody's another. But if you come to see that individuality is unreal, that you are really a fragment of the state, that your real self is the self that's part of the state, then what you, the real you, really wills is whatever the state wills. Because there's no real you apart from or isolated from the state. And therefore you, the real you, can have no goals except, no real goals. You can have apparent ones, but that's just how it appears to you. But really, you can have no goals except in your capacity as a cell of the state. In effect, what you really will way down deep, so to speak, what you will in your capacity as a fragment of the absolute is what the state decrees. And therefore, there is no compulsion possible against you. You're always doing what you will to do, even if the police send you to jail for life on a trumped-up charge. If they're doing it at the decree of the government, the state, the real you really wishes this, the you qua state fragment, and therefore there will be true freedom for the real you, even though the illusory apparent you seems to be in difficulty. Now if you say you don't see this point, you don't see that your real will is different from your apparent will, that merely indicates that you are at a lower stage of the dialectic process, and you're joined by a large company at that lower stage, as Hegel would be the first to admit. The people, quote, this is now from Hegel, people, quote, does not know what it wills. To know what we will, and further what the absolute will, namely reason, wills, is the fruit of deep knowledge and insight, and is therefore not the property of the people, unquote. You see from this that Hegel would obviously not be an advocate of representative government, popularly elected government. He was a strong authoritarian in politics and advocated a form of monarchy with power in the hands of an elite presided over by a monarch on the order of a Prussian monarch. Practically, in this particular type of state that he sets up, to be free means to have the right to obey what the government tells you to do. I can't resist here giving you a brief quote from Bertrand Russell, who, for all his other sins, nevertheless did not subscribe to the Hegelian concept of political freedom. A quote from Russell commenting on Hegel. This is a very superfine brand of freedom. It does not mean that you will be able to keep out of a concentration camp. It does not imply democracy or a free press or any of the usual such watchwords which Hegel rejects with contempt. Russell has here a footnote saying, freedom of the press, says Hegel, does not consist in being allowed to write what one wants. This view is crude and superficial. For instance, the press should not be allowed to render the government or the police contemptible. Russell continues, when spirit, that's the absolute in the third stage, you see, when spirit gives laws to itself, it does so freely. To our mundane vision, it may seem that the spirit that gives laws is embodied in the monarch, and the spirit to which the laws are given is embodied in his subjects. But from the point of view of the absolute, the distinction between monarch and subjects, like all other distinctions, is illusory. And when the monarch imprisons one of his subjects, that is still spirit freely determining itself. Unquote. So the absolute is always free. Who are you to complain? Now you see the gross perversion of the concept of freedom involved in this. I don't think I have to comment on that further. While we're on Hegel's politics, before we come to the culmination of it all, I'd like to point out one other of his very influential political views. That's his so-called theory of heroes. Heroes. In his defense of monarchy, he stopped short of advocating complete dictatorship. But in his theory of heroes, he makes little effort to conceal that this is his idea. According to this particular theory, a few superior human beings throughout the ages have been selected by the Absolute to be its special representatives here on earth. It's in process of self-development. Every once in a while it designates some particular human being as its agent. And Hegel refers to these people as, quote, the agents of the world spirit, unquote. He mentions in particular with great admiration Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. And these individuals, these heroes, are endowed with a special mission by the Absolute, namely to advance it in its process of evolution, of development, which you can translate as, in effect, carry out the will of God at that time. The hero is properly contemptuous of the masses. He's guided only by providence. What's characteristic of him is that he seizes the initiative and takes direct action. Says Hegel, he, quote, is the one who can put into words the will of his age, tell his age what its will is, and accomplish it, unquote. You see, the normal masses don't know what their will is, but the world historical hero designated by the Absolute knows. Through this hero, the Absolute, quote, impinging on the outer world as on a shell, bursts it in pieces, unquote, and thereby furthers the course of destiny. Now, Hegel is quite open that these designated individuals wreak havoc upon the lives of the rest of mankind that they are dragging along to destiny, and that they leave a trail of death and destruction in their wake. Quote from Hegel, so mighty a form must trample down many an innocent flower, crush to pieces many an object in its path, unquote. But since they are emissaries of the Absolute, they are, of course, exempt from moral judgment. Quote, moral, from Hegel, quote, moral claims that are irrelevant must not be brought into collision with world historical deeds and their accomplishment. The litany of private virtues must not be raised against them, unquote. In other words, the end justifies the means, the end here being the furtherance of the plan of the Absolute, and if that requires mass slaughter, that's perfectly justified from the perspective of the Absolute, and that's the only perspective you can have. Now here you see you have sanctioned by this complex metaphysical system an open call for a militaristic dictator to burst the world in pieces in accordance with his particular concept of destiny. Here you see issued by the most prestigious German philosopher of the 19th century, an invitation for a Führer to step forward and say that he was the representative of Providence and that he's equipped with a mission that requires him to rain destruction upon men on a world scale. And of course, as we know, several people eagerly stepped forward to apply for the job once it was issued. So much for Hegel's idea of freedom and of the function of the state and of his political views. Now, I'm not going to trace the rest of the career of the Absolute in this process of coming to realize itself. I merely want to point out to you that the state is not yet the highest version of the Absolute. Because let us grant, which of course we can't, but just for the moment to get on, let's grant that when we reach the state, all individual human beings are unified, aufgehoben into one organism. Even so, at this stage of the human mind, the Absolute hasn't yet achieved complete self-awareness. Now, if you ask me why, well, remember what I told you at the beginning. The Absolute is everything. If it's to achieve complete self-knowledge, it has to then get to the point where it realizes that it's everything and everything is it. Up to the point we've reached, even if we grant that all individual human minds are unified, aufgehoben into one, at this point, the human mind, that is to say the Absolute at this stage, doesn't yet recognize that it's identical to the physical world. It still thinks in such terms as mind versus matter, thought versus existence, subject versus object. If and when the Absolute came to grasp that these distinctions were unreal, that there was no ultimate distinction between mind and matter, thought, thing, subject, and object, if it came to realize that mind and physical nature were at bottom identical, then you see it would see that it was everything, and everything was it. It would have reached the jackpot of complete self-awareness and come to the end of its quest. Well, at what stage in the development of the human mind does the Absolute come to see this? Well, think. Who is it that told us for the first time in a major way? Who is it that first grasped that the distinction between mind and matter, subject and object, consciousness and existence is unreal, and those two are really the same thing? Hegel. Consequently, with the articulation of Hegel's philosophy, the human mind has finally come to grasp, and that means the Absolute in its dialectic evolution has finally come to grasp that it is everything and everything is it, that all distinctions are obliterated, that it's all aufgehoben into one, and that that's it. In other words, it's with the development of Hegel's philosophy that the Absolute for the first time understands its true nature, sees itself as the one sole reality, and reaches its climax. So that with the discovery of Hegel's philosophy, the Absolute achieves complete self-consciousness. Hegel's philosophy, in a word, is the culmination of reality. It is the goal of all reality, metaphysical. Quote without comment a sentence from Professor Stace. Quote, "This conclusion has subjected Hegel to a good deal of ridicule. Since what it implies is that the sole purpose of the entire universe, with all its immense stellar systems, was to arrive at the Hegelian philosophy." Unquote. No comment can be made on a claim of that sort. I guess the only thing you could say is that whatever his other sins, he did not suffer from an excess of Christian humility. Now, a few points to note in conclusion
of our presentation on Hegel. First, his thesis, implicit in what I've said so far, which is known as the thesis of historical determinism. Historical determinism. This is the view that history has inexorable laws of its own, built into the very process of history. That history, in Hegel's version, operates in accordance with dialectic necessity, so that everything that happens throughout human history in any field is absolutely necessary. Thus the word determinism. It's called historical determinism because the idea is that in the very process of history, each step is necessitated by the preceding. If we want to understand historical development in any field, according to Hegel, we must always approach it by the triadic method. Find our thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and we will then see that the entire progression was inevitable. And Hegel worked diligently in the field of history and tried to apply it to virtually every main subcategory of history: the history of nations, the history of art, the history of philosophy, the history of religion, and so on and so on. Now I'll give you one example of his application of a dialectic triad in his study of religion. This particular one is designed to show that the emergence of Christianity is dialectically necessary, that Christianity is the highest religion. It's going to be the synthesis of a preceding thesis and antithesis. And I give you this just as an example of what Hegel does in a whole variety of different fields. The thesis, as far as the development of religion is concerned, we can identify simply as Oriental religion. According to that view, there's only one infinite God, all-powerful, utterly unlike man. Well, that by dialectic necessity must generate its antithesis. And what is the antithesis of that type of religion? Well, obviously the classic, look what I said. The classic religion of Greece and Rome. According to that version, as you know, the gods were finite, not infinite. There were a great many of them. It was a polytheistic religion. The gods were limited. They were anthropomorphic, conceived very much on the human level. So it was, the Greco-Roman religion was the antithesis of Oriental religion, and therefore, of course, was dialectically inevitable. Given the Oriental religion, we had to have its antithesis. Well, of course, we know that wherever there's a thesis and antithesis, we must have a synthesis. The synthesis, in this case, will be inevitable, and in it, the preceding two will be aufgehoben, reconciled, etc. And that synthesis is Christianity. How does Christianity reconcile the preceding two? Well, simply like this. It agrees that God is infinite and that God is finite. It agrees that God is omnipotent, utterly different from man, and it agrees that God is a man. How does it do this? In the theory of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of the incarnation. Now, if you're familiar with the Christian dogma on that point, you know that the Christian official doctrine, at least in the great many sects, is that Jesus Christ is neither just an infinite being like the God of the Orient. He must be a human being, otherwise his sacrifice doesn't redeem man's sins. But on the other hand, he's not just a finite human type of being, like the God of the Greeks. He's the Son of God and is himself fully God. In short, the Christian dogma is that Jesus Christ is at once fully infinite and fully finite, fully God and fully man. Well, you see, that's a setup for the dialectic interpretation, because both elements are synthesized, aufgehoben, into one doctrine. As far as the one versus many gods, well, Christianity has the Trinity. You know the doctrine of the Trinity. The Orthodox viewpoint is Christianity is a monotheistic religion, so there's only one God. But on the other hand, there are three, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit,
And the orthodox view is that each of those is separate from the other, and each is fully God. There are doctrinal reasons why they have to say this, otherwise, for many other reasons, they're required to say that God the Father was crucified on the cross, which would be not possible in the Christian view. In the development of Christianity, therefore, the preceding thesis and antithesis are aufgehoben. We have at once a God which is finite and infinite, one and many. In other words, as you see, the Orthodox Christian view is indeed riddled with contradictions, which Hegel used as a great advantage because that proved its superiority as it combined opposing elements from all the preceding religions. In any event, to his satisfaction, he had proven that Christianity was a superior religion. And that I mentioned just as an example of Hegel's use of the dialectic process in interpreting human history. That type of historical analysis became very common after Hegel. Marx used it, only applied it to the economic realm, and it became central to his system, as we will see next week. The general principle of it, deriving from Hegel, is everything happens as necessary, unavoidable by dialectic law. History has some goal of its own, and it's moving of necessity on to the next stage and the next and the next. Now, if you've ever argued, for instance, in favor of capitalism with people today, a certain type of objection emanates straight from Hegel. The sort of person who will hear your argument and say, well, that's all very fine, but capitalism is outdated. History won't stand still. You're against the current of history. There's a certain type of person who will say to you, well, your arguments are fine, but you just can't return to the past. Now, if you ask why not, I mean, assuming that aspects of the past were more rational than aspects of the present, why can't we reinstate them? The idea is history will not let us. History is off on its own toward destiny, following the dialectic process, and human beings simply have to adapt. Why can't we go back? The real answer is Hegel won't let us. Now I have one last brief point of an epistemological nature in regard to Hegel, and then I've concluded what I want to say about him. He claims that his whole philosophy is true. Now, what could a Hegelian mean by declaring that a philosophy, or indeed any idea, is true? That brings us to Hegel's theory of truth. Prior to Hegel, philosophers had traditionally defined truth as correspondence between a mind's ideas and reality. They had held the idea there's a reality out there, there's a mind in here. The function of the mind is to know reality, and when the mind's ideas state actually the way facts are in reality, those ideas are true. When they correspond to reality, they're true. When they depart from it, they're false. That's called the correspondence theory of truth. An idea's truth is determined by its correspondence to reality. But of course, Hegel cannot accept that theory of truth because he abandons the whole metaphysics on which it's based. There is no distinction between mind and reality, and the function of mind is not to know some outside reality. So this whole foundation is out, and truth cannot be an issue of an idea's relationship to reality. But we still need some standard by which to distinguish true ideas from falsehoods. Well, what standard will we use once reality is out of the picture? Truth, says Hegel, must be an issue of an idea's relation to something, but it's not an issue of an idea's relation to reality. Well, to what? Well, what else is there? Says Hegel, truth is an issue of an idea's relation to other ideas. To other ideas. To call an idea true, this is the Hegelian view, to call an idea true is to say that that idea has a certain relationship to other ideas that we accept, that it fits in with other ideas we accept, that it's logically connected to those other ideas. that in effect, crudely, it goes along with the rest of the ideas we accept. Now, this relationship between an idea and the rest, when it fits into them and goes along with them, is given the technical name of coherence. Coherence. And this is known as the coherence theory of truth. An idea is coherent if it fits logically into a system of ideas. If it's necessitated by those other ideas, and it in turn necessitates them. That's the Hegelian definition of truth. Truth is not an idea, is not an issue of an idea's relation to reality, but of its relation to other ideas, specifically of its coherence with those other ideas. I'll give you a simple example taken from one Hegelian. He says, we all agree that the belief in the devil is false. The statement there is a devil is false. But he said if we accept the correspondence theory, we would never be entitled to call this statement false. Why? Well, because he says we could never prove that in reality there is no devil. You can't prove the non-existence of a devil in reality, he claims. I'll answer that one, the error in the question period, if you wish. But in any event, he says, since we can't prove the non-existence of a devil, but we know it's false, when we say it's false, that must be on some grounds other than whether or not there's a devil in reality. And on what grounds do we reject the belief in the devil? It just doesn't fit in with the rest of our intellectual beliefs. It's incoherent with our intellectual world, with the whole scientific approach. The idea of a devil doesn't cohere, in effect, with the theories of modern science. It's either you accept the idea of the devil or the theories of modern science. So that if you accepted that there was a devil, that would bring our whole intellectual world down in ruins. And therefore, we conclude we reject this idea as false, not on the ground that there really is no devil in reality, not on correspondence grounds, but on coherence grounds. Namely, it does not fit in with the rest of our ideas. Now, please understand, he's not simply saying, really, there is no devil in reality. And therefore, the idea doesn't mesh with the rest of our ideas. He's saying we have to abandon the question, what is there really, and simply observe that one idea doesn't fit in with the rest. That's what we mean by calling it truth. Truth is the coherence of an idea with our whole system of ideas. Now you may say, well, what do the Hegelians do with this question? Human beings are fallible. Knowledge is limited. What if an idea coheres today, and then tomorrow somebody advances a new idea, we have a new type of experience, and we find that the idea that cohered, that fit in best at one stage, didn't fit in at the next stage. Frequently the example is given that Ptolemaic astronomy fit into the whole medieval worldview and was coherent, but then the Copernican theory came and displayed a greater coherence. It fit in to many more facts and observations. Is all truth then on this theory relative? On the ground that what coheres today may not cohere tomorrow. Is all truth relative? To which you get a typical Hegelian answer when you ask this question. You get yes and no. In one sense they say yes, all truth is relative. So long as man is finite, there's always the possibility that he'll have to revise his system of ideas. An idea which coheres today may not tomorrow. We therefore will have to expect constant alteration in our ideas. In that sense, none of them can be regarded as fully true. And they say even the coherence theory of truth can't be regarded as fully true. Nothing can be regarded as fully true at this stage. Until we reach infinity. Till there's nothing more to learn. And then, of course, no revisions will ever be required. At that point, we will reach a system of truths which will then be absolute, immutable, unalterable. We'll reach the perfectly coherent system. See, we'll have reached the absolute. This comes only when human beings achieve omniscience. Until that time, we can't say any idea is fully true. We can say an idea has a modicum of truth, i.e. coherence, but also a modicum of falsehood, i.e. incoherence. Only when we become omniscient can we ever say an idea is fully true. Hegel expresses this thought in one of his better-known aphorisms: the true is the whole, with the W. The true is the whole. In other words, omniscience is a precondition of claiming complete truth for any idea. Now, Hegel personally, so it seems, and at least in certain moments, believed that he had reached this complete omniscience, this completely coherent system of beliefs, that he'd reached the full truth for the first time, and that was an end. But his disciples in Britain and America were more modest on this point. They say, we haven't yet reached the complete system of coherent truths, yet we will only reach that at infinity. But it's still the ideal to aim at. We want to approximate as closely as we can at any given stage to this ultimate system. Now, this theory is pretty bizarre. I don't think we need to go into further elaboration. I want merely to acquaint you with it in these few broad strokes because it was influential on the pragmatists. When we get to pragmatists in several weeks, you'll see that their theory of truth can be regarded simply as a development of the coherence theory, and in that sense a development from Hegelianism. But on this we will, I'll have to ask you just to wait and see. For now, I think you should have some idea of what the essentials are of Hegel's absolute idealism and some of its more important consequences, and we will conclude as far as Hegel is concerned at this point tonight. Thank you. Now, we'll take a 5-minute break, but I will then give you the comments on Kant that I promised by the simple expedient of preempting the opening section of the question period and asking myself a question, which I will proceed to answer. So if you want that material, I'll make that question one in the question period, but I'll give those of you who have to leave a few minutes to do so. All right, now the first question I'm asking myself is make some criticisms of Kant from an objectivist viewpoint. Now, I do not want to take the whole question period, so I'll give you a few essential criticisms. In the course of the 2 weeks that we spent on Kant, I gave you so many falsehoods that I would need equal time to take care of all of them. So I'm going to just pick out a few central points to give you a lead as to what I regard as some of Kant's essential errors and how to answer them, and some of the points I make will become fuller and clearer when we get to the presentation of Objectivism at the conclusion of the course. Now, I won't say anything this evening about the analytic-synthetic dichotomy. It is, of course, crucial to attack that whole distinction between analytic-logical truths on the one hand and synthetic factual ones on the other, because the whole Kantian way of coming at the problems of philosophy starts off from that distinction. But because I've written a series of articles in the Objectivist going over that distinction one point at a time, I don't see that there's any point in repeating all that material here this evening, so I refer you to those articles for a discussion of that. The analytic-synthetic dichotomy rests on a certain theory of concepts, and if you grasp the Objectivist theory of concepts, the collapse of that dichotomy is almost obvious, and we don't have to therefore discuss it at this point. I want to start by pointing out that Kant's basic conclusions are fundamentally wrong, and that they must be wrong. His philosophy, as a matter of logic, could not be correct. And then we'll see where his errors were. He claims that human consciousness is invalid, that we're not conscious of reality as it is in itself, only of a distortion of reality, only of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. Now, abstracting away from all the details, what is his main argument in favor of this? How does he claim to establish that the human method of perceiving and conceiving the world engenders a distortion? Well, if you recall his basic argument, which we stressed last week and the week before, it's this: certain ways of perceiving and conceiving the world are necessary. They're inescapable. We cannot do without them. Therefore, he concludes, they are merely mind-contributed, subjective, not reliable guides to reality, just subjective falsifications. Whether you take his argument on the perceptual or the conceptual level, it comes to this. If a certain form of awareness is necessary, if human consciousness must be aware of reality in that form and can't escape that particular form, then that form is a distortion and doesn't give you reality as it really is. Now, ignore for a moment the specific things which Kant ascribes to human consciousness, that is the inbuilt space filter and the time filter and all the categories, etc., and consider just his general premise, which is this. If a consciousness must perceive reality in some specific way, if it's limited to specific means, to specific processes it must perform, then that consciousness is invalid and does not perceive reality as it really is. Now the question to ask is there any possible consciousness to which the same argument would not apply? Let your imagination roam in as bizarre a fashion as you wish. Project the most grotesque types of consciousness, utterly unlike man's. Imagine an amoeba has a consciousness, or imagine there was a God and he had a consciousness, or imagine a Martian whose whole sensory apparatus is radically different from ours, etc. Still, whether you go from the amoeba to man, the Martian, or God, the consciousness that he has is something. It has some specific nature, some specific identity. The law of identity is a law applying to everything which exists. It tells us that everything which exists is limited, everything which exists has identity, and that applies to consciousness also. It too is limited to a specific identity. It's something. It has some specific means of awareness as distinct from others. And that's true of any consciousness. If a consciousness has identity, it then must perceive reality by some specific means and in some specific form. And if that's its nature, it can't perceive reality differently. Well, by Kant's argument then, such a consciousness is invalid. Any consciousness has identity. Therefore, it's restricted to a specific form of awareness of reality, which it must employ. What Kant is really saying is that the fact that consciousness has identity invalidates it. The fact that consciousness is something means it can't perceive reality as it really is. When could it perceive reality as it really is on this view? Only if consciousness were nothing in particular. If it had no nature, no particular means of functioning, no necessary forms of awareness, only then would it perceive reality as it really is. But of course, if there were nothing in particular, it would have no identity. It would be nothing. It couldn't exist. On Kant's view, consciousness of any type could never perceive reality as it really is. Only reality as it appeared to that particular type of consciousness. So God, if he existed, would read the critique and moan, I never perceive things as they are in themselves, only as they appear to God. And the amoeba would moan to the amoeba, and the Kantians to man. And in all cases, the fact that their consciousness is something debars them from access to reality as it really is in itself. But now ask, what does it mean to say you don't perceive reality as it really is in itself? There's no such thing as reality as it really isn't in itself. Reality as it really is in itself is a redundancy. There's only reality or existence, and the alternative to that is, Hegel to the contrary notwithstanding, non-existence, nothing, which doesn't exist. If you say about a consciousness it doesn't perceive reality as it really is in itself, that simply means it doesn't perceive reality, which means it doesn't perceive existence, which means it is not aware of anything, which means it is not a consciousness. If you say man doesn't perceive reality as it really is in itself, you are saying man is unconscious. That actually is the main meaning of Kant's whole argument. It's an all-out attack on the possibility of consciousness as such. His argument amounts to saying, because consciousness has identity, it can't exist, which is, of course, the complete reverse of the truth. It's only because consciousness is something that it can be aware of the world. Now that, in general terms, is the main error in the Kantian approach. Now, where did he go wrong? What led him to that? Well, let's go back to the starting point, the problem of necessity. You remember, we couldn't get necessity from our experience of the world, and therefore he argued it must be a mental contribution. And since those mental contributions include space, time, causality, and all the rest of the world's crucial features, we ended up with a reality that was unknowable. Now we have to challenge what led Kant to this conclusion. We have to, in other words, be able to solve the so-called problem of necessity, to arrive at the knowledge of necessity on the basis of experience. Now, before I indicate to you the outlines of the objectivist view on this question, I'd like you first to observe that Kant's solution to this problem is worthless even on its own terms. Even if you grant him that there is an insuperable Humean problem, he has not resolved. Because what is his explanation of man's knowledge of necessary facts? Well, in principle, his explanation is this. In an unknowable noumenal realm, something unknowable occurs. And when the unknowable material passes through unknowable filters, that guarantees necessity in the world we experience. Now, I submit that that is worthless as an explanation. To say the activities of our noumenal minds account for the necessary laws of our experience, and then to add, however, these activities are unknowable, makes your solution come out as this. Something unknowable takes place, and that guarantees our laws. Now, that is obviously not an explanation of anything. You cannot solve problems by appeal to the unknowable. On this one point, Hegel was correct, although, of course, not the moral he drew from it. Now, if we're on the subject of Kant's problems, I can't resist just a few words on the central argument that I presented last week, namely the transcendental deduction of the category. You could attack this at enormous length, but I want just very briefly to indicate one or two of the cardinal errors in that whole transcendental deduction. I think the first and main point to make about it is that whole construct, which I labored for an hour last week to present, is entirely, grossly arbitrary. What are the facts that we observe? That human beings can, as a matter of fact, integrate fleeting sensations into integrated percepts, wholes, as Kant called them last week. And as a matter of fact, we agree this can be done. Kant proceeds arbitrarily to assume that this integration of sensations into percepts requires an incredible complexity of conscious mental processes on the part of the mind. Remember, involving reproduction of images of the past, fragments, and scanning them, picking out the relevant ones to reproduce, all of it being guided by a rule, which is a concept telling you how to put them all together, and so on. Now, what is the warrant for developing this whole incredible construct to account for the observed fact that human beings can integrate sensations into percepts? And I say there's no warrant whatever. Why not simply say that the integration of sense experiences into percepts is an automatic physiological process determined and performed by the nature of the human brain, a process that occurs on the neurological, physiological level, and that it's simply a fact that the human brain is so constructed that after a variety of sensations, the brain automatically, physiologically retains and integrates it into percepts of wholes. Now, if you take that view, you do not require that whole complexity of reproduced images and concepts guiding it, and etc. Observe that on any theory of human cognition, you have to take certain facts about human cognitive capacities as the given. As far as epistemology is concerned, you may be able to explain the capacities of the brain physiologically, but as far as epistemology is concerned, you cannot have an infinite regress. You must take certain capacities, certain cognitive capacities on the part of man for granted as the given. Even on Kant's theory, he has to take certain cognitive features for granted as the given. That man possesses memory, that he has the capacity for synthesis, that he has certain a priori concepts, etc. Kant starts with that as the given. He doesn't account for it unless you regard him saying that its source is something unknowable, namely the noumenal world, as an explanation, which it obviously isn't. Now, if you must start somewhere, why not start with what is known to be given, namely a brain of a certain kind with the ability to integrate sensations into percepts? I think there's a very close parallel here in terms of what Kant's approach in the transcendental deduction is and the standard argument of the religionists in favor of God. You know, one of the standard arguments for God is, oh, the world is so lawful. Now, lawfulness couldn't be inherent in reality. It must have some source, and therefore it's God that accounts for it. And if you then say to them, well, how come God is lawful? They say, well, he just is. After all, you have to start somewhere. Well, of course, obviously, if you have to start somewhere, you may as well start with what you know, namely a reality which operates a certain way. Well, I think it's similar for Kant. He observes that the brain has certain capacities. And instead of taking that as inherent in the brain, he proceeds to invent a whole complex apparatus to account for it. And when you ask him, how do you account for that complex apparatus, his answer is, well, that's just it. That's where we start. So I think the whole theory is an answer to a non-existent problem. To say nothing of the fact that even if you granted the transcendental deduction as acceptable, I mean, that it requires some incredible mental conscious process, his particular solution is obviously hopeless. I'll give you just one point. It involves you in an infinite regress. He says, if you recall, that when the fragments go by, you can't simply retain past fragments by the nature of the brain. We must instead reproduce them mentally, form images, scan them, and combine them, synthesize them into a whole. Well, suppose for a moment you granted we actually went through this fantastic process. Still, and let's suppose we're looking at a face and we've actually gone through this laborious process of reproducing all the images of the nose, the lips, etc., that we saw earlier. It's still the case that we couldn't retain all the images in one mental frame. And suppose we recreated all those images as we're focused on the image of the lip, the image now, not the original fragment, but the image that we recreated. You've lost the image of the mouth. And so once you look to the image of the mouth, you have to form a new super image of the image of the lip to keep it alive in your consciousness. But of course, as soon as you look away to the nose, you lost the super image of the lip, etc., 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 ad infinitum. Now I say nothing whatever is accomplished by this process. A sensible theory is to say it's simply a fact that human beings, by the nature of their brain, have the capacity to retain the past and integrate it to the present. You do not need to go through the laborious Kantian process of reproducing images and combining them via the guidance of concepts and so on. Now there are many other points you could make, but I think that at minimum will suffice for the transcendental deduction now, this evening. But now the question is, well, what is the solution to the problem of necessity? How can we arrive at a knowledge of necessary truth from experience, assuming we were born tabula rasa, we didn't have innate ideas, and we didn't have an innate mental structure, simply the capacity to experience and the capacity to form concepts? If we could answer that problem, we would have answered Hume's problem, And then the whole Kantian construction on necessity becomes unnecessary. Well, the first thing you would have to do is ask yourself, what is meant by necessity in this context? What is meant by calling a fact or a statement necessary? Notice, the first thing you have to do is define the concept. There's no hope of solving this problem if you don't know what you're talking about. Now, the Humean method consists of expecting a percept of necessity, as though it'll be a little blob like a red, only it'll somehow come out as necessity, and he looks eagerly when the rock hits the window to see the necessity, and he can't find it. Now, that is obviously a hopeless approach. It's a conceptual problem. It has to be solved on the conceptual level. And the preconception of it all is that you have to define what you mean by necessary. Now, in common sense, what does it mean to say that some fact or statement is necessary? Well, synonymously, we could say, to say it's necessary is, it must be so. That's not a definition, but just a synonym. It must be so, has to be so. The opposite is impossible. Well, what is impossible? Only one thing, namely a contradiction, an A which is non-A. To say that a fact is necessary is to say that the opposite would be a contradiction. The opposite would violate the law of identity. Necessary really means implied by the law of identity. By necessity really simply means by identity. A proposition is necessary means to deny that proposition is to endorse a contradiction. If you take any example of a necessary truth, you will see that what's meant by saying that it must be true is that if it isn't, a contradiction is involved. The simplest example is 2 and 2 make 4. That must be so. Well, what do you mean by saying it must be so? Well, you say, you imagine any alternative. You would then have 2 and 2, and 1 and 1, and 1 and 1 does not equal 1 and 1 and 1 and 1. See, 2 and 2 doesn't equal 4, which would be a self-contradiction, a violation of the law of identity. As soon as you know that, you know the proposition in question must be necessary. Now, if we have this framework established, the next thing to observe is that if we're speaking metaphysically, as I say about the universe, every single thing that happens in the universe is dictated by the identity of the acting entities. Given an entity of a certain identity, certain nature, a certain action on its part is necessary. And I mean by necessary just what I've said. Any other action would involve a contradiction. Now, of course, that brings us to the law of cause and effect. If we can establish the law of cause and effect, we will have established that everything that occurs is necessary and solved the Humean Kantian problem. How does objectivism establish the law of cause and effect? Well, in essence, this is not original with objectivism. The main ideas are derived from Aristotle and have been endorsed by Aristotelians other than objectivists in this respect. Give you now a proof of the law of cause and effect, starting simply from observation. First premise of the proof is that actions are actions of entities. There can be no action apart from the entity which acts. If I said to you, for instance, there's an awful lot of running going on 34th Street. And you said, oh, who's running? And I said, nobody. The street's empty, just running. I said, that's fantastic. Running requires the entity which runs. If I said, there's a lot of eating going on in the banquet room, you say, who's eating? I say, nobody there. Just eating, just the sheer process of digestion. That'd be the Heraclitean word. I say, that's fantastic. Action is always action of an entity. And action is simply the name for what an entity does. Now, the next point to notice. The kind of action that an entity can perform is dictated by the kind of entity it is. The capacity for action that an entity has flows from and is determined by its nature. A cigarette, for instance, cannot eat. And if you ask yourself why, you see that inherent in the concept eating as a specific type of action, a specific type of entity alone is capable of performing it. Eating involves apertures, living creature, digestive apparatus, etc., none of which are possessed by a cigarette. Inherent in the concept of any action is always reference to the type of entity which alone can perform it. The sun that is up in the sky. Can't study, for an example. Because if you take the concept study as a type of process, it presupposes an entity with brain, consciousness, etc., and therefore is inapplicable to the sun. In other words, what a thing can do depends on and derives from what it is, from its attributes, from its nature. So we have, as proposition 1, actions are always actions of entities, and then as observation 2, what an entity can do depends upon and derives from what it is. And now add the law of identity. A is A. Every entity is limited. It is only what it is. It has only the capacities it has. It has no other ones. It has only certain specific attributes. It does not have contradictory attributes. Well, it follows from that in any specific set of circumstances, the action an entity performs is dictated by its nature. And under those circumstances, that entity could perform no other action. Now imagine as a simple example this cigarette, which I'm holding. The non-causality view would argue like this: when you let it go, it could rise, it could fall. Take just those two possibilities. Of course, they give it unlimited possibilities, but let's take just those two. Now, if you grasp that what a thing can do derives from what it is, if the same entity under the same circumstances had contradictory capacities, those contradictory capacities would have to flow from contradictory elements within the nature of the entity. For instance, for it to have the capacity to fall would require that it have one type of mass in relation to the air. It would have to be heavier than the air, as distinct from a feather or a balloon. For it to simultaneously have the capacity under the same circumstances to rise, that would have to derive from a different contradictory attribute of the entity, namely mass or weight less than the air, like a feather. If the same entity in the same circumstances could do both or either, that would have to mean the same entity in the same circumstances possesses two contradictory attributes, one underlying and making possible one, and the other underlying and making possible the other action. But A is A, and an entity does not possess contradictory capacities, contradictory attributes. Therefore, it does not have contradictory capacities. And that means that given any entity, which always has a specific nature, and given the circumstances in which it's acting, it has only one capacity for action. And that is therefore the action that it must perform. That entity, in those circumstances, must perform the action it does. By the very identity of the acting entity, nothing else is possible to it but to act in accordance with its nature. And when I say it must act that way, I'm using it in the sense we mentioned earlier. If it acted differently, it would be contradicting its own nature. It would be a violation of the law of identity. The conclusion is then, metaphysically, every action is necessary. It's caused and necessitated by the nature of the acting entities. Any alternative would be a contradiction. The same entity, in the same circumstances, must act the same way. And that's simply the law of cause and effect. The cause is the entity in a given set of circumstances. The effect is the action it performs. As Ayn Rand condenses this into one statement, the law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. And you see, the crucial premises are really two. You cannot sever action from entity, and entities have identity. Now, I'd like to make a brief aside on the question of free will here, in case you're concerned about that. Because as far as free human actions are concerned, those that derive from human choice, it's not true that they are metaphysically necessitated, since they're the product of choice. And this has to qualify my statement that everything that occurs in reality is necessary. I'm speaking in the context of metaphysical reality apart from the issue of human action. Now, of course, free will is not a violation of the law of cause and effect. There's been enough material, I think, in the Objectivist, so I don't have to rehearse that point here, but I'll be glad to answer a question on that if someone wishes to raise it. Nothing that I have said is not applicable to man, but because he has free choice, you cannot say that his particular choices are necessary. But for this discussion, we're focusing on metaphysical reality as apart from the issue of human free will. Now, if we understand this, we can simply say there is no such thing as contingency. There is no such thing as an event which happens to be but doesn't have to be. Leaving aside, again, this is the last time I'm going to repeat this qualification, leaving aside the question of human free will. To be is to be necessary. By the very fact that A is A, nothing about metaphysical reality could be different. Now, if you grasp this approach, you see that the whole Humean Kantian problem is a complete pseudo-problem. The way they look at the problem is this. They say, well, we have no real difficulty grasping that a certain fact is the case. But the big problem is, having grasped that it is the case, how do you know it has to be the case? Now, the answer that Objectivism gives to that is, if it is the case, then by that very fact alone, it must be. In other words, it's inherent in the law of identity. The opposite would be a contradiction. The problem that human beings have is how to discover what is the case. What are the facts? But there is no such thing as a problem of having discovered a fact and then having to go on and say, yes, but must it be so? If it is, and we're speaking metaphysically, then it must be. There's no such thing as a knowledge of necessity over and above a knowledge of what factually is the case. And indeed, I think you could make a good case for the conclusion that since to be in this sense is to be necessary, since everything metaphysically is necessary, the whole concept of necessity in a metaphysical context is simply superfluous. It doesn't contrast with any other concept. It doesn't identify anything that isn't already stated in the statement that something exists. And therefore, Objectivism would say, you don't divide facts into those that happen to be the case as against those which must be the case. You obliterate both categories, you see, and say the only kind of fact is that which is the case. If it is, it's inherent in the identities of the relevant entities. And you notice, for instance, the law of identity or formulation existence exists is simply a factual statement. It doesn't say A must be A or A happens to be A. It just simply says it is A. And the same, of course, is true. Ayn Rand did not write existence must exist or existence happens to be around, but it does exist. So much for the problem of getting necessity from experience. Necessity is reducible to identity, and identity, of course, the law of identity, we get directly from experience by perception. The material for it is given in every direct act of perception. You open your eyes and you see this picture is what it is, this ashtray is what it is, etc. You grasp that to be is to be something, a thing is what it is. Once you grasp the law of identity, causality follows as its immediate application. And that takes care of the so-called problem of necessity. And to allow you some question period, let's say that takes care of Kant, because at least the nerve of his philosophy, the issue that you can't get necessity from experience, has been severed. If I be permitted just one final comment, you're looking at Kant as a whole, you should be able to see now the very, very destructive nature of his entire philosophy. One of his contemporaries, Moses Mendelssohn, called him the all-destroyer. the all-destroyer, which I think is a very apt characterization. And you can see it simply this way. There are three crucial concepts at the base of any sane philosophy: existence, identity, consciousness. Kant's philosophy represents an assault on all three. On consciousness as such, for the reason I indicated earlier. It's not the faculty for perceiving reality. On existence, because it's unknowable. More than that, you can't even say that reality exists for Kant, because remember, both reality and existence are categories of the human mind, creations of consciousness. On identity, because the law of identity isn't true of facts, it's simply analytic and empty. On all three of these fundamentals, the Kantian philosophy is a massive attack. It's not a surprise then if later philosophers carry out the line as we see Hegel did, and we are in even worse shape than we are in Kant once he unleashed this torrent. The only last word I leave you with is, if it's possible, things are going to get still worse. For details, tune in next week. Now I'll take a few questions. The basic contradiction in Hegel's system appears to be at the beginning in claiming that pure being is nothing. Could you give an objectivist refutation of this? Well, I think I did in the lecture. No matter how abstract you get, you cannot separate identity from existence. Something from the being which is something. You cannot form any such concept as a being which is nothing in particular. Hegel's attempt is to allegedly abstract away not only from any particular qualities, but from the fact that the being is something at all. See? He tries to drive a wedge between the concept existence and identity, between being and being something. And then, of course, when he does that, he says, well, since being isn't something, it must be nothing. And therefore we've proved allegedly a contradiction. The only answer to that is you cannot formulate a concept of being, no matter on what degree of abstraction, which doesn't include in it that whatever is something. You may not know what any particular thing is. And if you're thinking very abstractly, you may not want to consider the particular qualities of any particular thing, but you can never drop out of the concept being the something which is. Because as soon as you do that, you've got nothing and you're in Hegel's position. How did Hegel decide when any dialectical chain he started along ended? Why isn't its synthesis just the thesis for further progression? That's a very good question to which I know no convincing answer. The only one I can think of offhand is that, because you see, if reality is a dialectic process, then this should go on in perpetuity. The only thing I can think of offhand is the Hegelian view that you get to the end by means of going in a circle. If you notice, I started with certain categories. And then by this long process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, etc., we finally reach the culmination, which is Hegel's philosophy. And now if you ask me, well, what's Hegel's philosophy, which is the ultimate synthesis? Well, I have to start over again with the first category, being, you see. So we go from being all the way through to Hegel's philosophy, and then Hegel's philosophy takes us back to being again. And so he would say that by the nature of his philosophy, the whole process comes to an end with him, and we simply would have to go around in a circle again. That's why his system is supposed to be absolutely coherent, in his technical sense of coherent. If you jump in with anyone, that leads you on to the next, and the next, and the next, and ultimately back to the beginning again, you see, and therefore you have one coherent system. But if you ask me, is there any rational answer to this? No, not that I know. The communists face the same problem, because for them, of course, the ultimate synthesis, and we'll look at that next week, is communism, industrial communism, and they're confronted with the question, well, if you believe in the dialectic process, how do you know that, why won't this lead to its own antithesis, etc.? And the answer I commonly get when I ask that question is, well, it will. Communism, when established, will generate its own antithesis, but we cannot now, at this stage of the process, even imagine what it will be like, and therefore it's profitless to speculate about it. take that for an answer. If, for Hegel, the truth of ideas is based on their coherence with other ideas, does this not mean their consistency or non-contradiction with other ideas? First of all, technically, no, it doesn't mean that. There are different interpretations of the coherence theory, but the one I'll give you is presented by Professor Brand Blanchard. If you're interested in the coherence theory, he has the one clear exposition of that theory across 3 chapters in a book called The Nature of Thought. And he does the best by that theory that anyone could possibly do. But he, in that book, explains that coherence does not simply mean that 2 ideas are consistent with each other. Coherence, a system is defined as coherent in the technical sense if any one idea, any one taken at random, necessitates any other one taken at random, so that every idea individually necessitates every other idea individually. In a fully coherent system, it's not simply that there's no contradictions among your ideas, but for instance, if I say Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, and I say 2 and 2 is 4. Too much modern mathematics. If I say 2 and 2 is 4. In a fully coherent system, you are supposed to be able to see each of those as all by itself necessitating the other. See? So starting from 2 and 2 is 4, you could derive, without reference to any other proposition, that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. Starting from roses are red, you could derive by absolute necessity that Hegel lived in the 19th century, etc. Any proposition necessitates any other. So it's something over and above simply that they don't contradict each other. Now, when you ask them how is this supposed to be done, since in any human concept of reasoning, you can't jump from any one proposition to any other proposition, they say the ideal of coherence that we're talking about, this type of absolutely coherent system, is something we cannot fully conceive at the present time. The closest we can get to it is in geometry, where you start with certain axioms and they necessitate the rest of the system. But even there, that's not completely coherent in their sense, because you can't get, like if you have 5 axioms, you can't get axiom 2 from axiom 1. It's independent of it. And you can't get theorem 29 simply from theorem 12, you see. In an ideal system, you're supposed to be able to get any one from any other. Doesn't Hegel's identity of opposites then require that all ideas are both true and false? Yes, and that's inherent in the coherence theory of truth. Since truth is not defined in terms of its relation to reality, but in terms of its relation to an ongoing system of ideas, any idea fits into some system, see, and to that extent has some truth. And any idea lacks, to some extent, this perfection of coherence that I earlier defined. Consequently, the advocates of the coherence theory say, as a matter of principle, every idea is partially true, even the most apparently grotesque falsehoods. Nothing is absolutely false. Remember, everything is an expression of the absolute. So if it's a round at all, it's got to have some kind of status. Everything, Blanchard gives the example that 2 + 3 = 6 is not absolutely false. It's predominantly false, but it's not completely false. On the other hand, they say it's equally the case that nothing is completely true, because everything falls short of that complete coherence, and they even say the coherence theory of truth is not completely true. It says as close as we can get at our stage, etc. Is Hegel not relying on the law of non-contradiction to test coherence? Well, he's surely relying on it as a precondition, because the minimum that would be required is that the things in question not be contradictory. And you say, how does he reconcile that with the law, with his identity of opposites? Well, this is the point. I'll just tell you this much. The Hegelians say they do not deny the law of contradiction. They say, certainly we accept the fact that A is A. We accept the law of contradiction. We agree with Aristotle's laws of logic. It's simply that those are the laws governing our understanding, which has some truth because everything has some truth, you see. But the dialectic process is a super faculty added on. And when you get to the dialectic process, you see that while what the laws of logic, Aristotelian logic, tell you is true, it's not the whole truth. In other words, they strive valiantly to say that they do not oppose the laws of logic, they simply put them in their place. But putting them in their place consists of saying that the truth, the highest method of knowledge, consists of accepting avowed contradictions, which are supposed to be there and not there at the same time. And of course, if you press a Hegelian, you say, well, synthesis includes a contradiction. He says, no, the contradiction's abolished. There's no contradiction there. And then later in the week, when he needs that contradiction for some purpose, he elicits it again. It was there, but not there, you see. So it's a system of doublethink, put it this way, applied to the law of contradiction itself. They do and don't accept it. See? When they need it, it's there, and when they don't, it's not. And that in itself is simply looking at it dialectically. If the real you, according to Hegel, is subservience to the state, who is to say who the real state should consist of? Wouldn't the people who are in power also be under the same influences of the lower levels of the dialectic process? Therefore, who is to rule? Is it to the progression of heroes? Well, in part, but Hegel has it worked out in terms of a triad. And it turns out that the monarch of the state is the synthesis of the preceding thesis and antithesis. And therefore, in the monarch, the preceding ones are all aufgehoben, see? And therefore, whatever he decrees in his capacity as monarch must represent their will and must be the real voice of the state because he is the synthesis. And in effect, put it this way, the synthesis is always higher than the thesis and the antithesis because it contains them while going on to the next stage, you see. And so if the monarch is the synthesis, he gets the power. Please explain how we can prove the devil does not exist. Well, I'm glad you asked. No, because I didn't have time to cover that. I would answer you by telling you that you cannot ask that question in that form. There is a very crucial principle of logic, which is known as the onus of proof principle. It states that the onus of proof is on the person who claims the positive. By positive, we mean here the claim that something existed, that something is the case. And this principle of logic says that if someone says that something is the case, it is his responsibility to give evidence in favor of it. If he can do so, then you either have to answer his evidence or agree with it. If he cannot, you are logically required, obliged to reject out of hand his statement without any need on your part to refute it or to prove that the opposite is true. In other words, of two propositions, X exists, X does not exist. If the X exists is put forth arbitrarily, the negative one holds the fort and requires no proof. It can be asserted simply on the grounds that there is no evidence for the positive. Now you see the reasoning behind that logical principle very simply if you think what the alternative would be. The alternative would be that I could come out with any fantasy in the world that I wanted, that anybody could, put it forth entirely arbitrarily, and ask you then to tell me, prove that it doesn't exist. But the fact is, it is impossible to disprove an arbitrary assertion that something exists. Suppose I look at somebody and say, you committed a murder last week, prove that you didn't. And I'm free to make arbitrary assertions. Now, I tell you that you could not prove that you didn't, as long as I'm free to make arbitrary positive assertions. He says to me, well, I have 3 witnesses to testify to my presence during the whole week. I was nowhere near the alleged victim. I say, witnesses can be bribed, prove that you didn't. He says, well, I was in the hospital with a broken leg during the whole week. I said, well, it's easy enough to hire an actor. as a stand-in, take your place in the hospital, prove that you didn't. Now, if I'm free to make arbitrary assertions that something happened, there is no possible way of refuting what I say, because that would require that nothing be something. And the whole trick here is to remember that nothing is nothing, contrary to Hegel. If you didn't commit a murder, if there isn't a devil, then that devil is nothing, that murder is nothing. Nothing does not leave any positive traces in reality. You couldn't say to me, point out to me the facts in reality that follow from the non-existence of a devil, which is what it would mean to say, prove to me that there's no devil. If there's no devil, there's no devil. The devil is simply nothing. Consequently, there's nothing to point to. There's no special effects or consequences that you could point to and say, you see, that particular phenomenon is a direct consequence of the non-devil. There's no devil, there's no devil. There can't be a proof of nothing. See? And therefore, the only way that you can establish that something exists is by evidence that it exists. All that's required to establish non-existence is the absence of evidence for the positive. And in the case of a devil, there is no evidence whatever in favor of it, and you simply say the onus of proof is on the person who claims it. In logic, in the absence of such evidence, there is no devil. In reality. I think we can take one more. Maybe a couple of brief ones. Is the view widely held in social science that truth is determined by an intersubjective consensus of opinion derived most directly from Kant or Hegel? I would say from Kant, because that's the essence of the Kantian definition of objectivity. Remember, to be objective is the collective subjectivism. All the subjects individually agree, and that unanimity makes it objective. Whenever you spot the phrase intersubjective used in a context where you would expect objective, you know that you're up against ultimately a Kantian influence. The same is true of the type who uses the word public instead of objective. Such and such is public in the sense that reality is public. You may have hear that type of formulation. That again is a reflection of the Kantian view. Has Ayn Rand's topic for discussion at the Fort Hall Forum been decided? If so, what is it? Yes. I don't recall the exact title, but it is, I believe, on the current anti-industrial, anti-technology viewpoint, and an attack on that. As I recall, that's what it is. All right, our time is up, so we will continue next week.
This course continues with Lecture 5.